Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Lonely Liberal Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Zankin, and I'm so happy to have you on this lovely Wednesday afternoon. We got a great show for you today. We're going to be talking about something a little somber, but very relevant right now, which is fentanyl. And basically, it's framing now by the Trump administration as a weapon of mass destruction. And for those who don't know, just last night, Trump signed an executive order declaring illicit fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction. And if that phrase, weapon of mass destruction, that is, sends shivers down your spine, you probably were alive during the Iraq/Afghanistan war, which, of course, that WMD kind of phrasing was a big reason why we went to war with those guys after 9/11. And it's a phrase that you don't hear that often. And so when the Trump administration now signs an executive order now calling fentanyl a weapon of mass destruction, it's hard to not connect the dots between the two, especially with all the tension going on in Venezuela. And it does kind of feel like, is this some weird move to try to justify some sort of conflict with Venezuela? So what I thought we could do today is kind of talk about, what the fentanyl crisis has been, how it's been going over the last, 10, 15 years, what it looks like nowadays, and does Venezuela really play a meaningful role in U.S.-bound fentanyl? Because if something does happen with Venezuela and fentanyl is used as one of the reasons why, we should know if it actually is true or not. So we got a lot to talk about today, and so without further ado, let's get to it. All right, so I think we should start with some fentanyl basics, right? Which is, what is it? So fentanyl is a synthetic opioid used medically. It's a painkiller, basically, right? But obviously the crisis that we've been having with it is illicit fentanyl, right? Fentanyl not actually made under the kind of watch of pharmaceutical companies. And a good way to understand its potency, how strong is it? It's basically between 50 and 100 times as strong as morphine, and that's why it's so dangerous, right? Because when something is that strong, the dosing, even in a medical setting, can be so sensitive because too much is so dangerous. And you often hear, and you'll see it in the executive line, that 2 milligrams is enough to kill somebody. And, well, obviously that changes of the tolerance of someone and the size of someone and whatnot. It doesn't really matter if it's right or wrong exactly. I think what it shows you is how potent it is as a potential problem in the illegal drug market, right? Because it's so strong. And it's basically taken over the U.S. drug supply. And when I say drug, I don't mean like, Tylenol or Advil or whatever. I mean like illegal drugs supply. And this is a big problem. The way the CDC lays out waves of illicit drugs is the original opioid epidemic in the late 90s, a heroin epidemic in the 2010s, and this third wave, which is basically the fentanyl wave, which started in like 2013, 2014. And when they capture that, they talk about all synthetic opioids, but illicitly made fentanyl is the kind of main one of all those. Okay, so this has been a fentanyl problem since 2013, roughly. That's a good way to kind of log it in your brain of when this became kind of a thing. Specifically when talking about fentanyl, it's been 30-ish years of kind of opioids being an issue in the U.S. altogether. So let's take a look at where does it come from, because it's kind of more than just one place, right? So there are three kind of main ways to think about this. Kind of step one, right, which is the precursors. So the things that go into making fentanyl, not the fentanyl itself. And these things often come from China, right? It's a China-linked chemical supply. That doesn't, again, so that what that means is it doesn't mean fentanyl is coming from China. It means that the ingredients used to make fentanyl are often coming from China, okay? So that's called a precursor ingredient, right? The actual production / pressing of fentanyl, when it comes to fentanyl illicitly brought to the U.S., the most significant source of this comes from Mexico. basically all pieces of analysis and studies done on this has shown that the most significant source of illicit fentanyl that enters the U.S. comes from Mexico. And so then the third thing is, how does it get to the U.S.? Mostly through legal crossing. The CBP, right, the Border Patrol, says 90% or and more of fentanyl entering the U.S. comes through typical points of entry, the border, and mostly just through passenger vehicles. So the vast majority of fentanyl entering the U.S. that's made illicitly is just in a guy's car coming from Mexico. So it's not guys, climbing fences or whatnot. It's just someone in a car with fentanyl in their car. And again, this is the kind of story of fentanyl in the U.S. Precursor components coming from China, it going to Mexico, getting pressed, produced, and then going in a car across the border to the United States. This is basically the most common way fentanyl ends up in the United States when it's illegal. So the reason why it's so dangerous, we talked about how strong it was, but there are kind of two ways that it's really dangerous. One is in powder, right, when it's sold as heroin or something like that, and maybe cocaine or something like that. And two is when it gets pressed into counterfeit pills. So someone thinks they're taking like an ecstasy tablet or whatnot, and it's actually fentanyl. And so it's especially dangerous too when it is in this like cocktail of drugs. So it's like a fentanyl plus a stimulant or whatnot. So this is why like the supply chain stuff is so convoluted and so tricky, because it's not just cracking down on like fentanyl itself. It's cracking down on how it's combined with other drugs, how it's kind of masked as another drug. It's not as simple as just like tracking fentanyl. It's a really complicated kind of story, but I think this kind of narrative of how it kind of shapes up is a good way to think about it. And now that we kind of have an understanding of how it happens, you may have noticed that I have yet to use the word Venezuela, right? Because this is where we need to get very specific and very careful. Like I said, most of the evidence strongly suggests that the majority of U.S.-bound illicit fentanyl is Mexico-linked, with the precursor supply chains often tied to China-linked chemical inputs. Basically, no reports have shown there is any evidence that Venezuela is a meaningful manufacturer of or trafficking route, frankly, of fentanyl entering the United States. Now, that doesn't mean That doesn't mean Venezuela isn't a relevant place where drugs come into the United States, cocaine and whatnot. But if we're talking about specifically fentanyl, there's really no evidence at all that Venezuela plays a major role in either the manufacturing or trafficking of fentanyl into the U.S. So if you're trying to stop fentanyl deaths, you really wouldn't even be thinking about Venezuela at all. It's just not a country that is considered to be a fentanyl hub one way or another. You would be much more focused on either Mexico or China. And frankly, when you look at the original kind of executive orders / tariffs / state of emergencies that the Trump administration have declared, most of them were focused on China and Mexico, also Canada, very weirdly. But it really was focused more on this kind of China-Canada stuff. Now, the China, again, it's just chemicals that go into it, and obviously chemicals have multiple uses, which makes it much more fuzzy, but with Mexico is kind of more on the nose if we're specifically looking on this, okay? So that's important story. And so the next question kind of comes down to then, okay, why label fentanyl a weapon of mass destruction, right? What does it change, and what could that basically mean for decisions going forward, right? What it does is it pushes the Department of Justice to make the sentencing around fentanyl much more severe, right? It expands the use of different kind of non-proliferation weapon of mass destruction kind of tools into an intelligence around those things into like the fentanyl world. And the biggest one, right, is it invites this kind of national security type of dialogue and involvement when dealing with fentanyl, right? So we've already kind of seen this with Venezuela, right? The use of calling the people on the boats that they're shooting, narco terrorists or national security risks, things of that nature. This is definitely in this same vein, right? Because they've been claiming, with very limited evidence, frankly, that these boats that they've been shooting down were not only drug dealers, but they're heading for the U.S. And they, you can use the very real scariness of fentanyl and kind of muddy the waters here. So now all of a sudden you're calling fentanyl a weapon of mass destruction. You now have this kind of very loosely but potentially effective storyline of why you can justify a war with Venezuela more formally, right? And obviously, like I said off the top of the show, this has this kind of Iraq echoing, feeling of the same way, but it's definitely not the same yet. We don't know for sure. It's a good way to kind of think about, maybe not a good way. It's a reasonable way for someone to think about something, but it's not one-to-one, right? A nuke and fentanyl and whatnot. And just because weapon of mass destruction is the same word doesn't mean it's the same. That being said, this stuff could change like that, right? I mean, all it takes is an announcement from Trump and, this could get more and more kind of clear. And then the other thing, when we're talking about war stuff, right, is that a war on drugs versus like a literal war powers thing is starting to get kind of blurry, right? Because at one hand, obviously Congress is needed to declare a formal war on someone. But what happens when it's a war on drugs or war on the entry of drugs and colluded with, illegal immigration or stuff like that? It starts getting a lot more fuzzy and it starts getting a lot more blurred. And when you have a Congress as weak as ours, in the sense of weak of like they're not doing anything, it starts to kind of make it kind of confusing and hard to predict what will happen. And what's so weird about all of this, and especially with this diagnosis, designation of fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction, is that overdose deaths of fentanyl has dropped significantly in recent CDC reports. So I'm not trying to say it's not a crisis. It's absolutely a crisis. But if we're looking at trend lines, the trends have dropped significantly, right? So this is good. So it does seem like weird timing to do this rather than taking a kind of a victory lap, which you would think Trump would be doing with that kind of data coming out. But it does. So all of this kind of makes people feel, and me included, that this is some sort of kind of narrative storytelling to justify conflict with Venezuela rather than actually trying to help people and fix a public health problem. We'll see. I mean, I think you would normally want to treat fentanyl as a public health / organized crime issue rather than a pretext for open-ended conflict, especially with another country. But you never know with Trump. And so I guess we shall see. And that's our show, folks. Thank you so much for listening today. If you like the show, please give it a 5-star review wherever you listen to shows. Or better yet, you can tell a friend about it and say, hey, you should listen to that guy talk about random things from, is our tourism industry getting crushed / do we have a major drug problem in the country? All interesting topics. No, but seriously, that would be really helpful. I really appreciate all you listening. Let me know what you think. You can either send me an email at thelonelyliberalpodcast@gmail.com, visit the website, or better yet, leave just a YouTube comment, and I will reply / read it and enjoy it. We will be back on Sunday with Rick to talk about this and maybe some other stuff that will happen in the news over the coming days, and maybe another list. People like the list, so maybe we'll do that. But until then, take it easy. I'll talk to you later. Bye.